I worked as a night janitor in a residential building in the heart of the city. The routine was always quiet, with no major surprises, until the night everything changed. It was just after 11 when I saw a woman enter the building. She looked ordinary, dressed in formal attire, like she had just come from work. She walked past me in the lobby, gave a polite smile, and headed for the elevator. I remember it well because it was the last time anyone saw her. The next morning, I was called into the security office. A resident had reported hearing strange noises during the night, like footsteps echoing in the hallway, but when they opened their door, no one was there. The manager asked me to review the security footage. That's when we saw the woman entering the elevator. She pressed the button for the 10th floor, but the elevator never returned to the ground floor. The cameras on the upper floors showed the elevator doors opening and closing at the correct stops, but no one got out. She simply vanished. The police were called, and a full investigation began. The officers searched every corner of the building, from the penthouse to the basement, but there was no sign of the woman. The stairwell cameras showed nothing, and all the apartments were locked. The footage was analyzed over and over, but there was no explanation. The woman had entered the building and disappeared. Then one of the officers discovered something strange in the basement, a locked door that wasn't on the building's blueprints. The door led to a dark, damp tunnel covered in dust, as if it hadn't been used in decades. The passage appeared to be part of an old underground tunnel system that, according to city records, connected the building to other locations in the city. The police shone their flashlights down the passage and followed it. The tunnel was long, with walls marked by scratches and symbols no one could identify. Farther along, they found something that left them speechless, a small underground room with a chair, chains, and remnants of food. The most unsettling detail, however, was the marks on the floor. There were signs of something, or someone, having been dragged through the tunnel recently. But the mystery deepened when the analysis revealed there were no human footprints, only strange marks, like claws scraping against the concrete. The team decided to seal off the tunnel and increase security in the building, but that same night, something else disturbing happened. While making my rounds, I heard footsteps echoing in the stairwell. I grabbed my flashlight and headed over, thinking it might be a late-night resident or even the police wrapping up their work. But when I arrived, the stairwell was empty. Still, the footsteps continued, now above me, as if something, or someone, was climbing the stairs. I followed the sound but could never catch up. When I reached the top floor, the noise stopped, and there was nothing but silence. The next morning, the security team reported that the elevator had been acting strangely overnight. It was moving up and down on its own, stopping randomly on different floors. When they reviewed the footage, the cameras showed the elevator empty, but the doors would open as if something invisible were entering or exiting. The police returned to the building but couldn't find any new leads. Over time, the case was closed as an unresolved disappearance. The woman was never found, and the tunnel was officially sealed. But sometimes, at night, I still hear noises in the hallways and see the elevator moving on its own. And when I walk past the basement, I can't shake the chill that runs down my spine, as if something is still down there, waiting. I always admired Dr. Victor Mallory. He was the kind of doctor everyone wanted, dedicated, charismatic, and with an impeccable track record of saving lives. At conferences, he was the star. It was common to see him on TV, discussing advancements in cardiology and how his revolutionary technique had given second chances to patients other doctors considered lost causes. But as an investigative journalist, I learned early on that no one is as perfect as they seem. And in Dr. Victor's case, perfection hid something horrifyingly dark. The first suspicions arose when I noticed a pattern in obituaries. Several of his wealthiest patients, who had undergone successful heart surgeries, died suddenly months later. At first, it seemed like a macabre coincidence, but the frequency caught my attention. I made a list of names and discovered they all had one thing in common: multi-million-dollar life insurance policies. That alone might not mean much, but what truly stood out was that every policy had been taken out shortly before their surgeries. Through contacts at the hospital, I gained access to some of the patient's files. All the surgical reports appeared flawless, but one detail repeated in every case: the same minor procedure that Victor insisted was necessary to maximize recovery appeared in all the operations. I consulted other cardiologists and learned that this procedure was unusual, almost unnecessary in most cases. I began to suspect that something was being done during these surgeries to predispose patients to future complications. The missing piece fell into place when I connected with an anonymous source from the insurance industry. I discovered that Victor had secretly invested in a company that financed life insurance policies for high-risk patients. The connection was clear: he manipulated patients into taking out policies, performed the surgeries, and months later, something happened that led to their deaths. As an indirect beneficiary, he was raking in millions. It was brilliant and horrifying. I decided to confront Victor under the guise of being interested in a procedure. During the consultation, he was cordial and professional, but there was something in his eyes, a constant calculation, as if he were assessing the value of my life. I asked questions about the procedure, and he explained it naturally, as if it were standard practice. But I knew the truth. I recorded the consultation and used the information to alert a group of medical authorities. An official investigation began shortly after. The hospital was swarmed with auditors and law enforcement, who seized files and computers. During interrogations, Victor remained calm. He had answers for everything: every procedure, every recommendation, even the insurance policies. He claimed they were a way to ensure his patients were financially protected. For a while, it seemed like he might walk away unscathed. The turning point came when a nurse who had worked with him for years came forward. She provided irrefutable evidence, recordings of Victor instructing staff to make minor adjustments during procedures that would drastically increase the risk of future complications, but wouldn't be immediately detectable. His voice, calm and almost indifferent, discussed the odds as if it were a game. "No one will notice," he said. When the evidence was presented, the mask fell. Victor was arrested and charged with premeditated murder, insurance fraud, and medical malpractice. During the trial, he maintained his composed demeanor, denying everything, but the testimonies and evidence were overwhelming. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison. The story shook the medical community and the public. How could someone sworn to save lives use their skill to destroy them? Even now, years later, the name Victor Mallory sends shivers down spines. And for me, the lesson is clear: the real monsters aren't the ones we find in stories but the ones who hide among us, wielding trust and respect as their weapons. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone. It was the type of place where people didn't lock their doors at night, trusting the idea that, far away from the big cities, we were safe. That sense of tranquility began to crumble when the first break-ins occurred. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. Just a strange feeling that someone had been there. Small things moved, doors that should have been locked found open in the morning. At first, no one paid much attention, but then came the bodies. The first was found at the Martins' house. The youngest daughter was the one who found her father, dead in his room, with the door locked from the inside. The police were baffled. There was no way the killer could have gotten out of the room. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Days later, a second body was found under identical circumstances, and then another. The pattern was clear: ordinary families, seemingly safe houses, and rooms that turned into deadly traps. The town went into a panic. People started reinforcing locks, buying security cameras, but nothing seemed to stop the killer. As a local journalist, I followed every detail of the investigation. The case seemed unsolvable until a small detail caught the attention of one of the detectives: all the families had recently changed their locks or made duplicate keys at the same locksmith, a man named Silas. He was known for his impeccable work, always polite and smiling, someone who would never raise suspicions. When the police first questioned him, he seemed calm, almost indifferent. He said he was just doing his job and that it would be impossible for him to remember all of his clients. But something in Silas' eyes didn't seem right. The police began monitoring him, and it was then that they uncovered the truth. Silas had kept a stockpile of secret copies of every key he had made. Each key was accompanied by a small dossier on the families, where he noted disturbing details, schedules, habits, even his personal judgments about each person. In his journal, which was found hidden in his workshop, he wrote phrases like, "They don't deserve the home they have," and "Security is a privilege, not a right." Silas' motivation was even more disturbing. He believed he was a sort of moral guardian, choosing who deserved the protection of their homes. The families who, in his twisted mind, were undeserving, became his targets. He would silently enter at night, using the keys he had made, and execute his victims methodically, always locking the rooms from the inside to create the mystery. When the police finally arrested him, he showed no remorse. At the station, he looked directly at the cameras and said, "You call me a monster, but I just revealed what was hidden. These people were already living in illusion. I just took what was never really theirs." His words, cold and calculated, terrified everyone in the town. Since then, no one in town trusts locksmiths. Many still avoid changing locks or making copies of keys, fearing that something similar could happen again. And even now, when I pass by Silas' old workshop, sealed and abandoned, I can't help but wonder how many families lived peaceful nights without ever knowing they had already become targets. I've always been fascinated by art, especially sculptures that seem to defy reality. When I heard about Lucas Delacroix, a renowned artist famous for his hyperrealistic works, I was intrigued. His sculptures captured every detail of human anatomy, veins, skin imperfections, even the texture of hair. Critics were unanimous in their praise, a genius. But there was something more. Interviews with Lucas often mentioned his secret material, a technique he refused to disclose. It was this mystery that made him even more captivating. When Clara Mendoza, a renowned art curator, disappeared after visiting Lucas' studio, the art world was shaken. Clara was known for her sharp eye and passion for discovering new talent. She had expressed interest in working with Lucas and was last seen heading to his secluded studio in the mountains. The police launched an investigation, but Lucas remained unfazed. In interviews, he simply stated that Clara never showed up. His responses were calm, almost indifferent, which only fueled the suspicion. Over time, more details began to emerge. Some visitors to the studio reported a peculiar smell, metallic and sharp, which Lucas attributed to the chemicals he used in his art. Others mentioned that despite the beauty of his sculptures, there was something deeply unsettling about them. Looking at his works felt like staring at corpses frozen in time. The tension escalated when another person connected to Lucas, a young photographer documenting his work, also vanished. It was the police investigation that finally uncovered the truth. After obtaining a warrant, officers raided Lucas' studio. What they found was described as a nightmare: dozens of sculptures, meticulously detailed, arranged in neat rows. But upon closer inspection, investigators noticed something horrifying. Fragments of human tissue were embedded in the sculptures, real strands of hair, a fingernail, even pieces of bone carefully crafted and treated to blend seamlessly into the artwork. The studio had a hidden room, locked with an electronic keypad. When police forced it open, they found what could only be described as an improvised laboratory. Surgical tools, containers filled with chemicals, and even an industrial freezer were inside. There, they discovered evidence of Lucas' crimes, body parts from his victims, stored as if they were raw materials. Among the remains, they found Clara Mendoza's engagement ring, confirming the worst. Lucas was arrested, but during interrogations, he showed no remorse. On the contrary, he defended his actions as an act of immortalization. "Human beauty is fleeting," he said calmly. "My sculptures are the only way to capture that beauty before it vanishes. My victims are not victims, they are part of something eternal." His words, delivered with an almost philosophical tone, were even more shocking than the grisly details of his crimes. Lucas Delacroix's trial became a media spectacle. His sculptures were seized as evidence, and the art world was thrown into chaos as they grappled with the revelation that the works they had admired for so long were the products of brutal murders. Lucas was sentenced to life in prison, yet he maintained a serene demeanor, as if he believed his artistic legacy outweighed his atrocities. Today, his name is no longer spoken in the art world. His sculptures were destroyed or locked away in police archives, but rumors persist that some remain in private collections, owned by wealthy eccentrics who display them as macabre relics. For me, the most disturbing lesson is that for years, we admired these works without realizing the horror they contained. Beauty, sometimes, is merely a mask for the grotesque lurking beneath. For years, the disappearances in our small rural town were an unsolved mystery. Young and old, men and women, they vanished without a trace. The police always tried to investigate, but there were never enough clues to draw any conclusions. At best, they'd say these were people who had probably decided to leave without telling anyone. But for us, who knew every face in town, that explanation never made sense. It wasn't until Mark, a man everyone thought was dead, returned years later that the truth finally came to light. Mark showed up at a local cafe, gaunt and weathered, like someone who had endured years of hardship. When asked where he'd been, he simply said, "I survived the group." The entire town was in shock. Mark had been a member of a well-known spiritual self-help group that, years ago, had gathered dozens of people searching for meaning in their lives. The group had changed its name and disappeared, but no one knew what had happened to its members. According to Mark, what started as an innocent self-help group quickly turned into something much darker. The leader, Elijah, was a charismatic man with a piercing gaze and a voice that seemed to mesmerize. He promised answers to the existential void everyone felt. "Here, you'll find the truth about life's purpose," he'd say. His words drew in vulnerable people, and, at first, Elijah truly seemed to help. But over time, his speeches became doctrine, and the gatherings turned into rituals. The rules began to change. Members were required to cut ties with anyone outside the group. Elijah insisted they were the only enlightened ones and that the outside world was a corrupt distraction. Voluntary financial contributions became mandatory, and anyone who questioned his authority was punished with isolation. Mark revealed that Elijah had an inner circle of chosen members who assisted him with divine tasks. It was this group that began eliminating anyone who posed a threat to the cult. Mark, who had been loyal to the group for a long time, started to grow suspicious when a close friend, Julia, disappeared after publicly questioning some of Elijah's practices. She had asked to leave, but the next morning, she simply didn't show up for the communal breakfast. When Mark asked about her, Elijah said she had received enlightenment and had moved on to other paths. Days later, another person vanished under similar circumstances. That's when Mark realized that no one ever truly left the group. One night, Mark heard noises coming from an isolated cabin used exclusively by the inner circle. He crept closer and saw Elijah and his followers performing what looked like a ritual. In the center of the room was a body. It was Julia. They had sacrificed her, and Elijah was proclaiming that her death was necessary to purify the group's energy. Mark was horrified but knew that if he tried to flee, he'd be next. He pretended to remain loyal for months, waiting for the right opportunity to escape. During one of Elijah's trips to recruit new members from nearby towns, Mark fled into the night, trekking miles through the forest to reach another town. There, he managed to rebuild his life, but the fear of being found never left him. He only returned to our town when he learned that Elijah had disappeared, leaving the cult in disarray. Mark's story was the key to connecting the disappearances. The police reopened the cases, and investigations revealed that several properties linked to the cult had underground chambers and ritual sites with traces of human blood. Some bodies were found, but many remain missing. Elijah was never captured, and no one knows if he's dead or merely hiding, ready to start over in another place. Today, the town still bears the scars of what happened. Many families never received full closure, but we all know that the tragedy wasn't an accident. It was the result of one man's manipulation, exploiting vulnerable people to create a cult built on fear and blind devotion. And sometimes, when we pass by one of the group's former properties, the silence is almost tangible, as if the ghosts of those sacrificed still linger, waiting for justice.